So if we do that, we can try to understand our soil biology test. So the first thing they analyze to detect availability or missing soil organisms. So they're looking at the test from a biology test to see what actual soil organisms you have. What is the balance of your effective microorganisms? Sometimes people may be missing some, and then you can add those back through like compost tea or worm tea extractions. That will allow us to basically define an approach or a formula for our compost making. Just don't, just put things in a pile, that's all I do, it's okay. Well, if I don't have a basis of where I'm at making the compost, I can't judge if it's making any difference to my plants. Next, we would convert to liquid extract and multiply any of the necessary organisms. So once I would identify that I may have a missing organism profile, we can purchase those. There's companies that grow the microorganisms, which are sold as EM, effective microorganisms. I then can purchase a little jar of EM, I bring it home, I can breed the EM, okay? Or some people do powdered compost extracts also to help with compost. As I said, we can also go to the forest, a real native forest, and get inoculated soils. So if we breed those microorganisms, I can then analyze that again, test to assure that they're there, at which time you can apply that to fields. So on a broad scale, they could do the same equipment, so that organic agriculture, stealing like an artist, taking the equipment that they were spraying pesticides and herbicides on the field, and now they're using that to apply compost teas, biofertilizers, okay? In our own home gardens, on a small scale, we can just apply it with a bucket or a watering pail. It's very easy. Then we do that, we take soil samples back and we test. Did the regime work? So this is called basically the concept and approach to soil fertility. And reasonably, it should be highly scientific. We need to, as a farmer and an ethical obligation, if I'm selling a product to someone, I really want to make sure it has the nutrients that they believe are there. So this is a really hard thing. So I'd have to even describe this to be beyond organic. So we have organic right now that's been given to us by the term, really by marketing. It's not necessarily soil associations, and the soil association being to some extent controlled by really large corporate farmers. So they have created this concept. But then if I ask, yeah, but I want to see a label. What's the minerals? They won't test that, though they can. So these are the type of next level that we'd be able to think about. Your cell phone. You walk up, you scan the barcode or QR code, right? Boom, tells me where it came from. I can see their soil samples. I can see their soil regimes, all right? And there are some proactive CSAs, especially in organics, that are starting to do this, okay? It's just not accepted as people have to. So what do I want to test for? We could even make charts that we try to break this up in more of an organizational skill. So in permaculture, you can see we're always talking about organization. What am I doing today? Also, what do I do in each season? When is the proper time for me to fertilize my fruit trees? When's the time to prune? When's the time to graft? When's the time for harvest of each different tree? Where's that chart? Who can remember all those things? So every single plant I have here. And so I try to get that into a schedule. So if we were thinking about seasonally, what are you going to do? What type of soil types do you mess with in different seasons? What are their structures? What's the root depth of different plants? Okay, if that's something you'd like to know. If you have any kind of weed pressure, so I'm having an issue, this crop gets pressured by this particular weed, what would I do to alleviate weeds organically? So we start to really get into like a book or a farming book. This is my journal. So I know what's going on. I know the season. I particularly know when it should rain. I know when the first frost should be, so I can plan for this. What diseases are prevalent on your farm? Plant diseases or animal diseases, and what do you do to mitigate those at particular times? So every year my flock tends to get this particular, like the bird flu or something, at which time I know that that's tied to the season change, so I could be proactive by doing this measure in order to reduce the losses. Insect or pest problems, they can also be tied to seasons. Litter lay, so in the forest canopy, when did the leaf fall? So if the leaf falls, that would help to stimulate my composting regime. And do you have anything like earthworms, microphods, fungal strands? How are you dealing with adding the larger animal sect, not just the bacteria, which we describe as EM, also adding in? So whether that's for us, we take earthworms, we have a farm, and we take the castings and we put into our garden, right? They obviously will be born. So these are things that you can look at. Some of the best practices that people can use, or management methods, if you will. Compost, right? are you going to buy it or make it yourself? In a very, very small scale, maybe if you're in a hobby, you can buy your own compost. And that's something to do with your money. But in any larger scale, you're going to need to make your compost. So the question here is, what do I grow on my farm to put in my compost to feed to my vegetables? See, we don't feed vegetables to compost piles. The percentage of food scraps that goes in is relatively less than 1%. So you can't have a composting regime because I save my food scraps. It doesn't work, okay? Even if you took your manure plus your food scraps, it's still not enough. What do you have, 2%? So we need to grow our compost. So think about, where do I grow greens, or where do I collect my browns, whether that's leaves or some type of waste stream of some other place, whether you want to compost cardboard, or can you get hay, can you get straw, can you get mulch? Where do you get these products, okay? And what is your source of compost tea? Are you going to purchase it? Again, on a very small scale, that might be okay. But in any larger scale, like trying to feed my whole family from my farm, I'm going to have to make these things, okay? So that gets into this concept of products. And if we have products, what are the inputs to the products? So I back up to say, where did the input come from in order? So I need to make my compost to make my compost tea to apply to my plants. And we back up. So habitat is another thing we want to think about within this system. So habitat and diversity relates directly to your species diversity. So the more species that are living in a place, actually the more species can proliferate. The food web gets more complicated. So the more complicated the food web, the overall diversity increases exponentially in proportion to each new species. So every time we can bring in a new species of, say, plant, so Raktamachat, it helps to create a more diverse food web, which then can create more diversity of, say, animals. So each year, we started with functionally no animals, nothing at Raktamachat. I mean, it's just a cornfield that they plowed, so we have dirt, there's nothing. And then within a period of 8 years, you get into where there's all kind of things, and even mammals now are starting to appear, with like the white squirrel that runs around. You know, so these things have to, for that to be here, it takes quite a lot to build up to that. So think about the types of foods. So how many different types of foods? Or how could you play with microclimates, temperature ranges, right? The shade versus the sunny areas. How could you, for instance, create oxygen or carbon dioxide? Though we have the concept of carbon increasing our temperature, our relationship to temperature. But most organic or large-scale commercial organic farmers actually install carbon producing machines in the greenhouses. And they create carbon and pump it into the greenhouse because it increases the yields of plants by up to like 15%. So that's a big difference. So then they're actually burning fossil fuels to create carbons inside of the greenhouses. So what about carbon dioxide? Is that something that you're going to think about controlling in your greenhouse? One way, like you could do that more naturally than burning things, is what if I put my chickens under my the chicken run, and then the chickens are in the greenhouse and they create heat, one, because that would be valuable in the winter, the little body of heat, and they also create carbon dioxide and methane in the greenhouse, so that would help my plants being captured. So these are things that we could think about. And any other physical gradients, so slope, topography, anything that you can do. But anytime that we can find differences, we can start to exploit the differences, meaning that I can get here and here. So I have better than if I'm only here. So I just have this one thing. So sometimes if we can make things go apart. So sunny, full sun, very shady. Now I can put plants from very shady to full sun. And that's why maybe I'll have a tree and understand its shade capacity. So parts of our garden that we walked in today were more shaded than other parts, and we would have plants specifically to those areas, so we have more microclimate. So limit conditions to those and select for beneficial organisms, like we asking about the flowers. Why do you have this particular flower? Why do you have that flower? Well, those particular flowers have those relationships with the beneficial insects, and they'll draw those insects into the garden. Then, for the less prevalent of our vegetables, that they will get pollinated because the insects are being attracted by those other plants. So try to determine in your garden or your soils if you have any missing biology, what's missing, and then you can work on providing for the habitat of that missing biology. And normally that's some type of food source. So this food source is missing, or the pH may be way off or something like this, and that particular microbiology doesn't like it. and then that goes up the scale. So I can't have this because, well, actually it's normally at the base that we have problems. So we can add organisms to our gardens through composting. ACT is the acronym for activated compost tea. Any type of inoculants, okay, or like for legume relationships with bacteria, any type of biocontrols that you want to use. So you could use different types of biocontrols for insecticides or herbicides, fungicides also. And what are the foods for beneficial organisms? So if we work on the food, there'll be more organisms. So keep the missing biology active by having food for it to consume. The aspect of when I'm feeding the soil with the compost, then the plant is the result. Monitor to make sure that your improvements have occurred. So start with your soil test, look at what you need to add. It may take time. I know when we started our garden here, we almost were functionally gardening on concrete. So such a hard clay content that it is really, really difficult. But over time, we kept adding compost, cutting it in, adding compost, cutting it in, adding compost tea, adding worms, working on that. And over time, we can build up to now where I can take my hand and shove it in 6 inches deep, okay, into very loose, well-maintained soils. But that takes time. Once it's maintained and you take your time with it, it doesn't really go backwards. So this is a good thing. So think about your program. So right, I need a program. I need my integrated soil fertility management or my gardening program. What are you going to do in the autumn? In that time period, what activities are going to take place? Examples like I could apply organisms to the soil. That might be activated compost teas. I could try to prevent disease growth if they were like funguses or something like that. I could try to improve the soil structure throughout the winter. That would be by watering and aeration, possibly adding in biochars. So during the winter, I could easily make biochars if I had stockpiled the matter. And I could add the biochars into the garden if nothing was growing and work on structure even though I couldn't grow anything. Monitor to determine what survives different regimes, what might still need to be added. So this worked, but I need to add this. And then next year, will approve that. What about pre-planting seasons? Like before the planting season, what activities should I try to do before that time? In a temperate climate, this could make the difference of getting my seedlings started in my home in a planter that's warmed 2 weeks before the first. And then I can also have like a closed system in the end of the season to mitigate frost, and I might be able to double my yield with these two techniques. Seeds. How do you apply organisms to seeds? So some seeds can be inoculated, and you can help that. What type of foods would they like? Mycorrhizal fungi on the seed, what's the relationships below, and then you can start to learn more of these relationships. So if you're having problems with seed germination, then we go to books. One that people kind of call this, one is called the Seed Savers Bible. Okay, great book, and another one's called Seed to Seed, and these are like classics. They're old, but you know this stuff has been figured out a long time ago. So try those books out. They're easily downloadable on the internet. And foliar. What am I going to do with foliar things? Like protect my leaves from diseases. Maybe I want to mitigate bugs, so I could create the things like chili or garlic sprays. Okay, if I want to have more of a fungal issue on my plant, then I could take things like Casuarina pine needles. So the Casuarina leaves, if boiled into a tea, creates a fungicide. Okay, so in this instance, I could mitigate a fungal infection. I just need to be careful, don't get it onto your soils. Okay, and maybe if there was something more like an insect issue, I could take neem. So if I boil neem in a concentrated neem form and I spray it onto bugs, it'll make them infertile. They can't have offspring. So they don't die, but they can't breed. Questions about your property. Okay, so these are things that you can add to my program. Provide maps and pictures so that when you're doing it and you're observing this field, I have a map, and then that can be nice, and then you have the information about like that particular garden or that particular food forest. It helps to stimulate your memory. What are sources for good compost? Where are you going to get this source? One of the hardest things we had when we came to start Raktamachat was we had no biomass. There's nothing growing. It's just clay. I don't have anything else. So we were able to get started basically because of the affiliation with the village, that we were able to get manures from the village. So we could use manures to make soils. So we had manure and basically rice husk only. That's the two things I had, that's it. But over time, with manure and rice husk, which is a pretty poor compost, we could grow weeds. Weeds grow easy. I could then grow weeds to get greens, and then I improve my compost. So I almost like start by growing the weeds. So what am I going to do to grow my compost? Or are you going to buy or make it? And buy is going to not really make it. If you have to buy compost, it's not really economical against buying vegetables. How will you attain that compost or compost tea? Where is it coming from? Who are you going to discuss this with? Who's your gardening buddy? Who's your gardening group? Who's your permaculture friend? So you talk to them about your farm, and they tell you about their farm, and you can discuss your soil samples together. You need to kind of build a relationship with someone to discuss things with. So when you leave, who's your permaculture buddy? Have you really looked at trying to think about a total food web analysis? So in this instance, if I start to look at looking for on my farm, am I getting bigger antrophytes? Am I getting bigger animals, right? More each year? That's a good indication. Am I seeing more diversity, like different species of frogs? Because frog diversity and species is really directly related to chemicals. So when there's a chemicalized farm, you don't really see those types of animals because of their skin relationship. They suck the chemicals in and die. So if after 5 years, we're now on our 6th year of being organic, we start to see these populations kind of exploding. So that's a really good indication of the chemical-free aspect. What about chemistry? So your soluble, exchangeable, and total, get a chemistry test. Soil tests are important to start with to know where you need to go, and keep retesting. They're really cheap. Some places it's actually free. So discuss the results, again, with who? Who is your buddy? And develop a calendar. So these are kind of the ideas of what I would do to think about my program, okay? So if you're very good, okay, and you can remember all kind of stuff, that's great. Maybe you can keep all that in your head, but the majority of people can't, okay? And it's not, you're gonna slip on something. So a calendar helps with organization.